Okay, so my name's Adam Wathen. I'm here to talk to you guys today about decoupling packages that you write from your framework of choice. So like I said, I'm Adam Wathen. That's me at my birthday party last year. I'm a software developer. I'm also a host of a podcast called Full Stack Radio that just started up. I used to be an audio engineer, so before I was a professional programmer, I used to record bands for a living. A lot of actual parallels between that and dealing with clients in the programming world. And I'm also a competitive powerlifter. Also, no one has ever seen me and Batman in the same room at the same time. So you can draw your own conclusions there. So like I said, I'm here to talk to you guys about decoupling your packages from your framework. And to do that, the first thing we have to talk about is packages. So about 3 years ago, these two guys were responsible for giving us what I would say is like the greatest advancement in modern PHP development since like PHP 5.3 came out. And of course, that's Composer. One of those guys is actually here at the conference this weekend, actually. So if you see Jordy around, thank him for making our lives a million times easier than it used to be. So for anyone who's not familiar with Composer, Composer is a dependency management tool for PHP that allows you to easily pull in libraries and packages that other people have written and you integrate that with your own code. It takes the best of things like NPM and Ruby Gems and Bundler from other programming ecosystems and brings them to PHP in a way that we never had before. One of the also big benefits that we got out of using Composer to pull in packages that other people have written is it's kind of forced us to up our game a little bit as far as things like semantic versioning are concerned. So now if you want to pull in a package that somebody else wrote and you want to be able to easily receive security fixes and updates and stuff like that, you can just specify that you need version 1.3.x and you'll get every patch release that ever comes out automatically anytime you run Composer update. Before that, when we were just copying and pasting snippets of other people's code from the internet down into our own stuff, if someone added a new feature or made some improvement performance-wise or fixed a bug, we really didn't have a good way of finding out about that. I don't know how many of you guys have like older projects where you're using jQuery or something and you pulled in a version of jQuery 1.6 point whatever and it just like sits forever in your public folder and never ever gets updated ever again because it works well enough. So now in the PHP world, we don't have to worry about problems like that. The fact that Composer also provides us with a really excellent, simple, stupid, easy autoloader that allows us to make use of all this code with just one line somewhere in the bootstrapping process of our application is just an added nicety. So Composer has been totally awesome. Along with Composer came this online repo of packages called Packagist, where we can easily browse for packages that solve a particular problem we have or post stuff that we've written for other people to use. And at the time that I was kind of updating these slides this morning, there was 42,288 packages listed on Packagist, and they had been installed a total of 413,057,365 times, which is pretty crazy to think about where we've gone. And like this is in 3 years since that stuff has been put up for us to be able to use, right? This level of like accessibility to other people's code and adoption of reusing other people's stuff was never possible, especially at this scale before then. Does anyone here maintain any packages or have anything on Packagist? Does anyone want to share what it is?
Client library for an API that I wrote.
Okay, awesome. So because of Composer, I'm one line of JSON away from being able to pull that in and play with it myself versus having to browse for it online or pull down a zip file and integrate it into my application or whatever. So that's pretty amazing. So I would say Composer and Packages together have kind of completely changed the landscape of modern PHP development compared to what we had before. Composer.json, that file that sits in the root of your project that specifies what your dependencies are, the name of your project, your license and all that stuff, to me, that's now like the backbone of everything that we build in PHP. Like that file is the first thing that I put into a new directory when I'm about to start a PHP project. And to think that 3 years ago we didn't have anything like that is crazy. So it's pretty awesome where we are today. Despite that though, because of kind of how the PHP ecosystem has evolved, instead of being a PHP community, we're a bunch of tiny little separate communities, right? There's a Laravel community, a CodeIgniter community, a Symfony community, a Cake community, a Zen Framework community, then not to mention the WordPress community and Joomla community and Drupal community. And all these communities are full of really smart people doing really cool things, but they're a lot of time only really talking to each other and building stuff for each other. Like I want to build this cool package that integrates with authentication in Laravel, so other people using Laravel can use this, or other Symfony developers can use this, or other CodeIgniter developers could use this. And it doesn't help that before Composer came around, a lot of these ecosystems had their own sort of bundling tools available and package distribution tools, like CodeIgniter had their own way of people being able to share libraries with each other. Before Laravel 4, before they jumped on the Composer train, they had their own way. WordPress obviously has its whole plugin ecosystem and stuff like that. So it's really easy when you're building a library or building a package to leverage a lot of the conveniences that your framework of choice provides for you and kind of forget about the fact that there's a whole other world of people using different tools that might benefit from some of the work that you're doing on this library that you're working on. So at first, I thought maybe I would just talk to you guys about kind of high-level concepts and design principles and stuff like that. But I thought it would be maybe more interesting if we just worked through more of a real-life example and talked about some of the changes that we can make along the way to make something easier for other people to use and more reusable. So I decided that we would go take that approach and go through an example. So about a year and a half ago, I had an itch to build a form builder package so that I could easily spit out forms and stuff in my HTML with kind of a nice fluent interface that looked something like this. So I could like open a form and that would spit out an opening form tag. If I needed to accept file uploads, I could just chain a multi-part call off that to change the encoding type. Or I could create a text input and add a placeholder. After that, I could add an extra class, or I could add an ID, or I could change the default value, and just kind of chain this stuff as much as I wanted in this nice fluent interface. A lot of other form packages I've seen have just like a big messy configuration array, which is kind of not as nice to work with. It also has stuff like HTML5 form validation stuff, like when something's required, or what the minimum value is, or the maximum value, stuff like that. So this seems like really trivial, right? Like building something like this that would work everywhere in every ecosystem is pretty straightforward. But there was a couple other features that I thought would make it really useful that made it a little trickier. The first one was that I wanted to be able to easily repopulate the form automatically with old input if for some reason the form submission fails. So say someone's trying to register for your application or something, and there was some sort of problem where they forgot to fill out a required field and you have to redirect them back to that page, and you want to automatically repopulate the form with the stuff that they put in before, instead of some boilerplate that looks something like this, where you have to check if the session or the request had some particular key in it, and then spit that out in the value field. I just wanted to have it in a one-liner. I didn't even want to have to think about it. I just wanted to say, form builder, render me the text field for this key. If there's a previous value that you have to populate it with, just populate it. I don't want to have to ask you about it. Kind of following the whole tell, don't ask principle, right? Aside from that, I also wanted to be able to easily retrieve error messages related to these different inputs. So instead of so I wanted to be able to do something like this. Spit out the text box, ask the form if there was an error, and then spit out the error into a specific tag if I needed to style it in a specific way. So a lot of this stuff is going to rely on different components that my framework already provides for me, right? Like if I want to flash something to the session, or if I want to get something from the request object, I need to figure out a way to incorporate that into this package. And trying to do that in a framework decoupled way was a little bit of an interesting challenge. So let's talk about this whole old input thing and trying to retrieve old input. When I was trying to figure out how I wanted this to kind of work from the outside in, I was thinking something like this. I have this form builder class. It's going to do a bunch of stuff related to building the actual form, but somewhere in there I needed some sort of private method where I could ask to see if there was old input for a certain key and populate the element with that value if it existed. I'm personally a Laravel user for all my projects that I start up. So in the framework that I use, you can do something like this in your controller, where if for some reason validating the form fails, I can just redirect back to where the user was before with old input, and that'll automatically flash it to the session. And if it works out, then I can just redirect them to the home page, right? And to retrieve that old input, I just ask the session class for the old input for that specific key. So my naive first implementation of this old input method in this form builder class might look something like this, where I just straight up ask that session class to give me the old input. I just expect that it's there. I expect that I'm working within the context of a Laravel application, that I can access that stuff and it's going to work fine. And this would work totally fine for me in the context that I was building this library, because I was building it in the context of a Laravel application. But I think that we can all agree that this is probably not the best way to do this if you want to build it in a way that other people are able to use the code that you're writing. Now, I talked about Composer and how you can pull in other people's code and dependencies and stuff like that. And the Laravel framework actually separates up a lot of its components into different packages. So you might think, well, why don't I just depend on Laravel's session implementation and add that to my composer.json file, right? If I want to use that session class, I'll just pull it in, and then I can use it in my code, and everyone else should be able to use it. It seems harmless, but the reality is that when you're pulling in this package, you're actually pulling in all of these packages. You're pulling in their cache package, the cookie package, encryption, the session, the carbon package, and like 6 Symfony packages. And these are all necessary for that session object to work, which means somewhere in your application you have to bootstrap all this stuff and set it up so that your session actually works the way you want it to. And if someone else is working in the context of another framework, there's a 100% chance that there's already some sort of session facility provided for them. And you don't want to have to force people using your library to have to maintain 2 totally separate sessions in their application just so that they can use some of the conveniences that you're trying to provide from this particular library that you're building. So what you might think next is, well, if pulling in that particular session implementation causes all these problems, maybe it's best for me not to just have any dependencies at all. I mean, PHP is a web-based language, and it actually, as part of the language, provides the session global, right? The session superglobal. So why don't I just rely on the session superglobal? I know anyone that's using any PHP framework is going to have access to the session superglobal because they're using PHP, and it's part of the language. But the problem with this is that just because you have no dependencies doesn't mean that there's no coupling. In a lot of frameworks, you can configure how your session is actually set up. You can have a session that's file-based, you can have a session that's cookie-based, a session that's cache-based, a session that's database-based. And a lot of frameworks don't rely on that session superglobal at all. So even though you have no dependencies here, you're still coupling the person that's pulling in your package to a specific session implementation that they have no way of being able to change. So what's the answer to this problem? Well, there's a few steps involved, but one of the first steps is to use a pattern that a lot of us have probably used every day, that a lot of us have heard about in other talks, and that's dependency injection, right? So Wikipedia defines dependency injection as a software design pattern that implements inversion of control and allows a program designed to follow the dependency inversion principle. Very clear, very straightforward. I think we all understand what that means, right? It's kind of confusing if you're not familiar with some of the other terms that they're expecting you to know. So I like to think of it a little simpler. To me, dependency injection is just about this. Instead of an object reaching out into the world and grabbing its own dependencies, anything it needs, it just kind of gets from wherever it wants, we give the object its dependencies ourselves. So the analogy I like to use here is imagine that you have a 5-year-old son and he's hungry and ready for dinner, and he's your library that you're building. And your house is your framework of choice. Well, your son lives in your house. He knows where all the food is. He knows that the soup is in the cupboard. He knows that the vegetables are in the fridge. He knows that the cookies are on the counter. It would work fairly well to just say, well, you are ready for dinner. Just go get whatever you want. You know where everything is in the kitchen. Just go reach in, pull it out, and have dinner and be happy. But the problem shows up when all of a sudden your component wants to play in a different framework, or your son is going to have dinner at his friend's house after school, right? If your son is trained to just go and look in the cupboards for things, and people at this other house keep their stuff in different places, he's going to be going through the cupboards looking for the soup, knocking stuff over, breaking everything, and just creating a big mess for everybody. It would make a lot more sense if you just trained your son to sit at the table and wait for someone to bring him dinner, and he doesn't have to know where the ingredients came from or what he's necessarily going to get, as long as he's getting something that he can eat, right? So instead of this implementation, where we're just reaching out to this, making this static call to the session class and asking it for the old input, we can actually inject an instance of that session object into our form builder class and just ask that session object to give us the old input for that particular key. So this is a step in the right direction, definitely a step in the right direction. It's definitely an improvement. But if you scroll up a little bit in that file, you'll notice that we're still coupled to that particular implementation. So we're still depending on Laravel's session implementation. We're just injecting it now. So we're not really that much better off. This is like if your son knows that he's supposed to wait at the dinner table for his food to arrive, but he won't eat anything that shows up unless it's pizza pockets. That's it. It doesn't matter if something else will work just as well and will totally satisfy his hunger. He will only eat one specific thing. He won't eat food, he'll eat a specific type of food. So the next step is to stop depending on concrete implementations and instead depend on interfaces. So in PHP, we're in kind of a special spot because we're a dynamic language, But unlike other dynamic languages like Ruby or Python, we actually have this explicit concept of interfaces as part of the language. So we can do something like this, right? Where we use the interface keyword instead of the class keyword, specify what we want to call our interface, and then we can just kind of list the public methods that any implementation of that interface has to provide. In a language like Python or Ruby, there is no interface keyword. It relies strictly on duck typing, so there's no way for you to kind of define this stuff for someone else to be able to see what they have to implement if they want to provide their own implementation of a particular component of a library. So a little bit about interfaces. You'll hear a lot of people say that interfaces are like a contract, which is true. So what you're basically saying is this component, when it depends on an interface, is saying, I just need someone that's going to do this job. I don't care how it gets done. And as long as it fulfills that list of methods that I'm saying it needs to have, everything's going to be fine. And then anything implementing that interface is signing their name on that piece of paper saying, I agree that I am going to implement every single method that you list here and that you can trust me to get the job done. Interfaces describe the public API of a role in your system, not really an object, right? So I like to think of anytime I use an interface as a collaborator, I'm not really saying I need this object. I'm saying I need something that can play this role. I don't really care in what way it plays that role or how it gets the job done. I don't care about the implementation. I just care about something that can respond to the messages that I need it to respond to and kind of do that job in whatever way it intends to do that job. So this is kind of the difference between like how something works and how it can be used. Interfaces don't provide any implementation, which I demonstrated in the earlier slide, but you can't provide any implementation at all in an interface. All you can say is, these are the public methods. You can't say any private methods. Public methods that this must have with these names, and these are the parameters that they must adhere to, that they must be able to receive. And because of the fact that PHP provides explicit interfaces in the language, they work as great documentation for your package. So if you're releasing a package that has some components that are implementing interfaces rather than being depended on explicitly, and someone else needs to write their own implementation, they can very easily just pull up that interface file, see a list of the methods that they need to implement, write their own implementation. As long as everything matches up, they can drop that in and everything should just work exactly the way it did before. It's a lot harder to do stuff like that in Ruby and Python, which I think is why in PHP we kind of embrace the idea of dependency injection and coding against an interface and depending on abstractions instead of implementations a little bit more willingly than they do in other dynamic languages. So one implementation of an interface for our purposes might look something like this. So we're going to create this Laravel session class that implements a session interface, which is the interface that I showed you guys earlier. All it has is that getOldInput method so far. In its constructor, it takes an actual instance of the actual Laravel session class, and then we just delegate to that the same way. So now instead of our form builder object actually specifically depending on the Laravel session implementation, it just depends on a session interface. And any implementation of that will work perfectly fine. So even though this particular implementation is coupled to the Laravel implementation, our actual form builder is not coupled to that because now there's a level of indirection in between. There's like an insulating layer that protects us from depending specifically on certain implementations. So we are depending on that. Like I said before, I talked too much about the details when I had created fancy slides for myself to make it easier for me to demonstrate. Yeah, so we can depend on the session interface in our actual form builder class instead of the Laravel session implementation and just pass in an implementation of that interface, which we just aliased to the same name that we had before and assign that to a protected property and everything's going to be fine. So what about other frameworks, right? Well, like I said, all we're depending on now is the session interface, not any sort of session implementation. So if you're in another framework that has its own session facility already provided for you, all you have to do is make a really lightweight wrapper like that one I showed you earlier that just depends on the specific implementation that you're using in your framework. Just implement that one method that the interface defines, pass that in, and everything's going to work. What about non-framework applications? Well, this is like just as easy. If you have some old legacy application that doesn't have any sort of robust session facilities and you're actually just relying on like the session superglobal, you can still write an implementation like this. Like this legacy session class still implements our session interface and it just reaches out into the session superglobal to ask it for stuff. And we're just following this convention of nesting any old input under this old input array inside the session, and that'll just totally work. And as you work on modernizing your application, maybe you introduce some other session facilities, you can write a different implementation for those. And wherever in your application you're bootstrapping all this stuff, maybe you have a dependency injection container or something like that, you can just swap out the implementation that you were using here with a more robust implementation as you improve the application. So we got one feature out of the way, right? The old input stuff, but we still have to worry about this error messages stuff. So I'm thinking that something like this, like I showed you guys earlier in the template, would work pretty well for what we're trying to do. We just want to be able to spit out the actual form element. We want to be able to ask the form builder if it has an error for that specific key, and if it does, we want to be able to spit out that error formatted in however way we want to format it. So we need to add a couple more methods to our form builder. We need this hasError method so we can ask it if it does have errors for this particular key. And we need this getError method so that we can actually retrieve the error for that particular key so we can display it however we need to display it. So like we talked about before with the old implementation, since we're building this in the context of a Laravel app, we could just do this again, right? We could just ask the session class for the errors, and if it has an error, we'll return true from our hasError method, and if it has that, and then we can just ask it to retrieve that actual error message for us as well. And this would totally work the same way in the context of the application that we're building. But we've already established this is the wrong way to do things. So why don't we just add these methods to our session interface that we defined earlier? So instead of just having this old input method, now we'll have a hasError method and a getError method. And we can implement those in the same way. In our Laravel session implementation, we're still passing in that session class, which we're depending on for our implementation of retrieving and asking about the errors. And we can just move those methods over and delegate them to the actual session object, just like we were doing for the old input, and everything would work well. So this looks pretty good, right? Like, what do you guys think? Does that seem like an improvement over where we were before? Does anyone see anything that could be better, maybe? So I see something that could be better. That's why this is a 50-minute talk and not a 20-minute talk. And that's that, why are we depending on a session interface? Like, why does this form builder care about the concept of a session? Why is it the session's responsibility to give us old input and to give us the actual error messages? Does the form builder really have to care that a session is even anything? Does it need to care that it's in the context of a web application? I don't think it really does. So the next step in trying to write packages that are more reusable, more decoupled from the environment that you're writing them in, is to really focus on identifying the right abstractions. So I'm saying that we don't really care about a session. I think we actually care about two things. The first one is somewhere to get old input from. It could be a session, it could be a cache, it could be the request object, it could be the file system, it could be a call to an external API. It doesn't matter. The form builder just cares that it receives some collaborator that knows how to give it the old input. When it asks for the old input, it gets the old input. It doesn't care that it's a session. And then, of course, it needs somewhere to get errors. And again, the errors could be in a cache, they could be in the session, they could be on the file system, they could be anywhere, they could be hard-coded into a file somewhere. It really doesn't matter. The fact that we're using a session in our particular implementation is just an implementation detail. So despite the fact that we kind of insulated ourselves from specific implementations by introducing this interface, the interface that we introduced was suggesting an implementation. So we still really didn't quite get all the way there. So our current session interface looks like this, right? It has somewhere to get old input, and it also plays the role of somewhere to get errors. So a simple solution to this is to just split the interface. Instead of having one session interface that provides all this functionality, we can just have an old input interface with one method that we can ask for old input, and an error store interface that supplies these two methods that allow us to check for errors and get the errors. And now our actual form builder class that was originally taking just the session interface as its only dependency can instead take two dependencies. So we'll pass in some implementation of an old input interface and some implementation of an error store interface, assign those away to protected properties or whatever, and then update our implementations that we're asking the old input implementation for the old input and the error interface implementation for the error stuff, right? So we can implement these the same way. We have a Laravel implementation that depends on the session the same way it did before. We have a Laravel implementation of the error store that depends on the session the same way it did before. In our legacy application, we are still depending on the session superglobal, which will work just fine in that particular application. And same with the error store. The legacy error store also is going to depend on the session superglobal because that's where we decided to store the errors. But now if we're in a framework like Symfony, where typically you're not flashing old input to the session, you're retrieving it from the request, we can write an implementation of the old input interface that looks like this, that takes the Symfony HTTP request object, assigns that away to a private variable, and asks the request object for the old input. So now our actual form builder class isn't dependent on a session in any way, and now we don't feel forced to come up with some session implementation that implements this session interface. This is a much more natural thing to do in other frameworks. So what we did here that made this work out a lot better for us is that instead of trying to create some God interface that did everything we need for every dependency, we really wanted to focus on one job, right? We wanted any collaborators to only be responsible for doing one thing. Even though both of the collaborators that we ended up passing in with the Laravel implementations were both pointing at the same other dependency, splitting those up makes it much easier for us to reuse this stuff in other systems where maybe the errors are coming from this session, but the old input is coming from the request. So now, because we have two separate interfaces that we can implement separately, this stuff can come from totally different places, and if one of them changes, we don't have to change how the old input works as well. We can just update that one particular implementation. So these things that really represent two different things now have the ability to change at different rates and in different ways, whereas before they were all tightly coupled together in one big bundle and everything had to be updated at the same time. So this idea of focusing on one job doesn't just apply to the collaborators that we're passing in to our package that we're building. It applies also to the package itself. So this form builder that I was building, what I really wanted to do was I was building a bunch of little prototype applications, and I was using Bootstrap for all of them, and Bootstrap provides a lot of nice form stuff, right, that if you just want to spin up some little crappy registration form and you don't care about tailoring the user experience specifically for your application yet, you can just use a bunch of markup that Bootstrap provides you, and it's going to look pretty good enough that you can focus on building out the features that actually deliver business value for this application that you're building, right? So you can make pretty forms that look like this, really straightforward, and when you go to submit a form like this, you need to add a bunch of extra classes and a couple extra elements and stuff to be able to display the errors and retrieve the old input and stuff like that. So the actual boilerplate for a form like this looks like this, right? It's pretty out of control. You have all these wrapper divs for all these different sets of form elements. You have to check a bunch of stuff. So that this parent wrapper up here, right? Anytime that there's an error for that element, you have to add a class to the parent element. So I have to be able to check for errors. If there's an error, I have to add this hasError class, which then propagates down to this other stuff and changes the color of the internal elements. I need to be able to put in the old input value, get that from the session if I need to. And I also need to be able to spit out this help block, which is in this p tag, which I only want to show conditionally on if there is an error. I don't want to show like an empty one if there's no error, because it adds like some extra margin to the bottom and screws stuff up. So you end up with all this really verbose boilerplate that's all like exactly the same. Like this is like exactly the same as that, which is exactly the same as that, which is exactly the same as that. So my real motivation for getting into this whole form building stuff was just to be able to reduce all this crap down to just this, right? I just wanted to be able to open a form, spit out a text element, and that would spit out that form group wrapper. It would add the hasError class if there was errors. It would add that help block if there was an error to display. And everything would just work. And then instead of having to duplicate that crap over and over and over and over again, everything would just be one-liners, and it would just keep my templates really clean and everything working really well. So what I could have done, right, is I could have built out this whole robust form builder implementation that managed old input, that managed errors and stuff like that, into one package that was catered specifically for spitting out Bootstrap markup, and that's all it could do. But instead, because I thought a lot of this functionality was stuff that other people might be able to use, like what if someone wanted to do the same sort of thing but with like the foundation markup, or maybe with like Gumby CSS or any of these other dozens and dozens of front-end frameworks. If you're using any of these other ones, you don't want to have to write your entire own form builder from scratch when I did 99% of the work just because I've tightly coupled it to the fact that I wanted it to display as bootstrap output at the end of the day. So what you can really start thinking about is focusing on one job, right? So just being able to generate straight up PHP, regular forms, nothing to do with front-end frameworks at all, and then optimize for composability. So I can take that package, build another package that is relying on a lot of the functionality that that underlying package provides, and just decorate it in this nice way to be able to do the boot form stuff. So this bootstrap form package has a dependency on this other form package. And all it provides is like this bootstrap form builder class that takes the other form builder class as one of its dependencies and delegates off to it for all the old input and session stuff. It doesn't even have to care about that stuff. It just happens automatically because the other package is doing it as long as you've implemented the right interfaces and passed in the correct implementations. And all this package has to worry about is spitting out the markup in the correct format so that it'll work with Bootstrap. And it turns out that I made a pretty good decision in doing this because if you look at Packagist, that actual form package has not a ton more downloads than the actual Bootstrap one does, but enough that I feel good that someone else out there is using that on its own, and they wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't split this out into two separate packages. So most of the people that are using it because it came as one of the dependencies for the other package, but there's some other people out there that can still use it maybe to display forms in some more customized way, specific to their application, and they didn't have to write all that crap themselves because I thought about it and thought it through enough that I split it out into separate packages so they could use the stuff independently. So something that I hope I have made clear as we've been going along is that when you're trying to build packages that are framework agnostic, that are decoupled from your framework, that doesn't mean that someone should be able to download your package and just use it in any context out of the box and not have to do any work. You just shouldn't get in their way. And by providing interfaces for any of your collaborators, you're giving those people the opportunity to write their own implementations. Whereas if you're depending on specific dependencies that are coupled to specific implementations, someone can't pull that in at all, and they can't use it in any way. If someone has to spend 45 minutes implementing your 3 interfaces that have 2 methods each so that they can use your package, that's better than them not being able to use your package at all. You can still claim that, my package is framework agnostic and works anywhere as long as it can work anywhere. It doesn't have to work anywhere instantly out of the box. You don't have to provide a Symfony service provider or a Laravel service provider or something that makes it bootstrap properly in CodeIgniter all out of the box for everyone to be able to use it. It's not about that at all. It's just about building stuff in a way that it's not explicitly tied to things that people might not want to pull in alongside of the package that you've built for them. So why should you care about this stuff, right? If you're just building something for yourself and you know that every project you're ever going to start is always going to be in some particular framework and you don't really care about kind of going through this extra work to make sure that someone else could use it, why should you care about putting in the effort to do so? Well, the biggest reason is that it encourages community collaboration. Like I was talking about before, because of how PHP has kind of evolved, there's a lot of little siloed communities that are all full of smart people doing smart things. And if you build a package that only works for Laravel developers, and someone in the Symfony world has a bunch of knowledge in that particular area that would be very helpful to you to be able to make it into something more robust and improve it, you're never going to hear from them because they're never going to download your package. They're just going to ignore it because it's not going to work for them. And same with other communities. If you build something that only works in the CodeIgniter world and someone who's a Zen framework developer needs something similar, they're just going to build their own instead of using yours because they can't use yours. So you end up with 7 different packages that can all generate PDFs and they all only work in specific frameworks instead of one kind of package that we've kind of all worked on as a community and made it into the best thing it can be with just a couple light wrappers around it maybe if you want to provide that bootstrapping stuff that hooks up all the dependencies and implements those interfaces that you've designed for people using different frameworks. We're here at a PHP conference. We're not here at a framework-specific conference. We're here because we think that there's stuff that we can learn from each other, even if we don't necessarily use all the exact same tools. So by focusing on designing our code in this way, it encourages that sort of thing. It lets us build stuff that anyone in here can use and anyone in here can give me feedback on, anyone in here can understand easily. They can submit pull requests, they can improve stuff for me. You can't do that when you write stuff that's only designed to work in one specific place. The second reason is that it's just good code, right? When you're focusing on building portable, reusable components and thinking about keeping things decoupled, you're getting a lot of benefits out of that beside the fact that someone can pull it into another application. Just like that whole session interface and old input interface and error store interface thing, if you were only building something that was meant to work within the context of that Laravel application and you still wanted to use a session interface or whatever, you might just leave it there. By forcing yourself to think, well, how can I make this easier for someone to use in another framework? You're forcing yourself to kind of identify what the real dependencies actually are and think about things from a higher level and build things in a way that it's easier for you to maintain in the future, even if you're just using it yourself. Like I was saying, with the difference between that old input stuff and the error stuff, if for some reason the error stuff needs to change, but the old input stuff needs to stay the same, you're going to have to figure out a way to break that up anyways. By thinking about things in this way, you kind of will uncover those sorts of differences earlier in the process and end up with code that is, focused on single responsibilities, follows stuff like the solid principles, is easier for other people to provide their own implementations. Everything about it is just better. So that's actually my whole talk. It went faster than I expected it to go. But I'm Adam Wathen on Twitter. I blog pretty frequently about stuff like this at my website, adamwathen.me. I host a podcast, fullstackradio.com, like I was talking about before. And that's the joined in link to rate the talk. So maybe there'll just be tons of questions and we can just chat for a while. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.